Welcome to everyone, both in the audience and also those who are following us through the live stream. My name is Jan Heiret. I am the director of the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Minority Studies. This is the third event in the series In the Shadow of the War, a collaboration between the University of Oslo and the HL-senteret. We are very grateful to the university for this collaboration. The intention with the series is to contribute to the Norwegian public debate with lectures and discussions featuring some of the world's leading scholars on current topics such as anti-Semitism and genocide. The goal is to highlight different aspects and delve deeply to foster reflection and greater insight. The topics so far have been distinguishing between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, Holocaust, anti-Semitism and racism, and today's topic, the problems with genocide. The series will continue in the fall. I hereby give the word and the floor to Dirk Moses. Please give him a hand.
Many thanks for the generous introduction to give this public lecture in this esteemed institution. I've been informing myself about the Norwegian Center for Holocaust and Memory Studies and its important research, education and public work on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. The University of Oslo is also very well known as an outstanding institution of higher learning. I think it's fitting that they co-host this series and this event today. It's a great honor for me to be invited and to be entrusted with discussing these difficult issues with you. As we can see, genocide has become a key word for our time. Since 2017, genocide is alleged in Myanmar with the Rohingya, the Uyghurs in China, and in the civil war in the Tigray region of Ethiopia. For 3 years now, genocide has been proclaimed in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Last year was the 30th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. This year is the 30th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide in Bosnia. On this slide, you'll see the planning committee for an event on that in Srebrenica and in Sarajevo in early July, and I'll be attending it. And only a year ago, the General Assembly of the United Nations passed a resolution recognizing the Srebrenica genocide, which was bitterly opposed by Serbia and Russia, who tried to mobilize opposition on the grounds that the motion, or the resolution, rendered Serbia a genocidal nation, although that term, of course, does not appear in the resolution. Genocide, of course, features in strictly historical research, for example, in relation to the settler colonial past of the United States, and the mass murder of suspected communists in Indonesia in 1965. In my native Australia, you'll see a book, my first book there on the left, the slogan of "No Pride in Genocide" is central to Indigenous politics and identity, especially on the national holiday, the 26th of January. So rather than Australia Day, you can see in the top left, Indigenous people call it Invasion Day. And I took one or two of these photos myself from these demonstrations. For their part, Armenians celebrate when any legislature, in this case Alabama, recognizes the Armenian genocide. And there they say, "Thank you, Governor Kay Ivey. You're the 49th state to do so." And as you can see, on this slide about the Overherero and Nama people's claim of genocide by German colonial authorities in 1904, the allegation is central to their reparations claim. And in fact, today is Genocide Day in Namibia. And I took this screenshot from the Vatican Times newspaper, who's also featuring it, and that's today's issue. Then, of course, there are the genocide claims swirling about Gaza. They are central to the largest global protest movement since the Second Gulf War. Some have felt threatened by the protest and the genocide claim, while others denounce the questioning of the genocide claim as a form of denialism. So needless to say, emotions are on edge, they're running high, and tempers are frayed. That's why I sense there are all these police officers at the back of the room. At one level, explaining why this is the case is not difficult. What social psychologists call large group emotions are at stake. In this case, intensified by the sense that national existence is at stake. But at another level, questions remain. Why is the genocide charge, well, so charged? Why is genocide so central to recognition campaigns like the ones I've just mentioned, when alternatives like war crimes, crimes against humanity are, in my view, no less heinous, no less grievous, no less evil? Why does the genocide claim demand absolute positions? A yes, it is happening, or a no, it's not happening, even leading, in some circles, to purity tests and charges of anti-Semitism, depending on whose side you're on. What is more, overall confusion reigns about what genocide even is and whether it applies to circumstances in armed conflict, the subject of today's lecture, in cases like Gaza, but there are many other cases. For example, the crushing of the Tamil insurgency or international liberation movement in 2009 and the lead up to that, very similar circumstances and statistics of death to Gaza today, and yet totally forgotten outside Tamil circles. Consider the perspective of the US politician Chuck Schumer and the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert. We'll start with Schumer. If you can read that, it's important, especially starting on the third line, where he says, genocide is described, and it bothers him, this charge against Israel, as a country or some groups trying to wipe out a whole race of people, a whole nationality of people. So if Israel was not provoked and just invaded Gaza and shot at random Palestinians, Gazans, that would be genocide. That is not what has happened, he says. In fact, the opposite happened. And Hamas is much closer to genocide than Israel, etc. Then we have, Schumer here, to elaborate, distinguishes between genocide, which he models on the Holocaust, and Israel's legitimate self-defense against a genocidal attack by Hamas, according to him. This is an article in the New York Times. It's not very hard to find. It was last week. If one follows this line of argumentation, it's understandable, in his view, and maybe even legal, for Israel to kill 60 times more Palestinians than Israelis died on the 7th of October, and also to destroy Gaza, the infrastructure, and so forth. Yet, on this view, it's Palestinians who committed genocide, not Israel. Indeed, he goes further and says it's anti-Semitic to allege that Israel is committing genocide, despite the grossly lopsided death toll and the utter devastation of Gaza, and now the open plans to deport the Palestinian population. Now let's move to Ehud Olmert, the former Prime Minister. This is what he said. This is a translation of an article he wrote in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, last week. What we are doing in Gaza is a war of annihilation, indiscriminate, unrestrained, brutal, and criminal killing of civilians. We are doing this not because of an accidental loss of control in a particular sector, he means the south of Israel, not because of a disproportionate outburst of fighters in some unit, but as a result of a policy dictated by the government knowingly, intentionally, viciously, maliciously, recklessly. Yes, we are committing war crimes. So let's unpack this quickly. He's talking about a war of annihilation, but he ends with the admission of war crimes, but not genocide. Okay. Now, these quotations reveal what I call the problems of genocide, which is why I titled my book that, on the history of the genocide concept, published in 2021, just before the invasion of Ukraine and, of course, the Gaza situation. The problems of genocide are many, but let us remind ourselves what Schumer and Olmert are saying, namely that although Raphael Lemkin, who invented the concept of genocide, was trying to outlaw wars of extermination, as he called them, when he coined the word genocide in 1942, somehow such wars have been separated from genocide in law, which is limited to what Schumer describes as a premeditated attack and an unprovoked attack on a group simply for being that group, and not in circumstances of armed conflict. Only this very specific and, in fact, mythical intention that never occurs in human affairs, to destroy, is criminalized in the UN Genocide Convention, not the results of a war of annihilation that everyone can see in Gaza or in the Russian campaign in Chechnya in the mid-90s. Some of you are old enough to remember what Grozny looked like after the Russians had their way 30 years ago. I remember. So we have the perplexing situation where the public can see destruction. And let's not forget that the word destruction or destroy is the operative word in the Genocide Convention, which talks about the intention to destroy. So we can see destruction, the destruction of Gaza, while the law, on the other hand, needs to infer the Israeli intent to destroy Gazans, Palestinians, from a pattern of state conduct. So there's this disjuncture between results and the need to prove an intention. It may or may not do that. That is, it may or not be possible to infer this intention when the International Court of Justice gets around to hearing the case launched by South Africa in a few years. Of course, by then it's far too late for Palestinians. Which brings us back to the absolutism of the emotions we see about us on this topic. If never again, the never again slogan becomes Europe's categorical imperative, and Holocaust memory becomes the source of international morality, as we saw in the Stockholm Forum statement from 2000, so 25 years ago. In other words, when preventing genocide and a second Holocaust becomes the center of international morality and public policy, then why would we not expect members of the public to react in absolute ways if they are convinced that genocide is occurring? Likewise, why would one not expect Jewish people to react in absolute ways if they are convinced that a second Holocaust or genocide is around the corner? That is what I see happening in the US, in Australia, and in Germany, where I've lived and which I study. I'm told the situation in Norway is little different. Now, what I think I can do as a scholar is to try to explain a number of aspects of the challenges we face in relation to these conundrums and this absoluteness in the positions. First, how and why we ended up in a situation in which genocide is the only term that victims and their supporters can use to gain recognition. And second, how and why we ended up distinguishing genocide and wars of annihilation, or if you like, genocidal warfare, genocide being criminalized by the Genocide Convention, but genocidal warfare, or what Olmert admits are wars of annihilation, are not covered by the Genocide Convention, although their outcomes look like genocide. That's what I meant when the newspaper in this country turned these sort of somewhat arcane academic ideas of mine into a slogan on the front page last Friday, right? So this sort of long introduction I'm giving you ends up being that, okay? Now, as I've only got 45 minutes and now probably 38, I can give only brief answers to both these questions. And the answer, of course, is complex because the questions are related. So here it goes. One reason is that where people cannot see genocide, they are less shocked by mass violence against civilians because genocide is regarded as the crime of crimes. This status, this hierarchy, is a problem, I think, because it inadvertently licenses civilian destruction by distinguishing between their driving logics. On the one hand, genocide is caused by ideologies of hatred in which racialized victims are targeted as such, as the Genocide Convention puts it, versus, on the other hand, military targeting in which civilians are killed collaterally or incidentally as a byproduct or a side effect of attacking a military target. The former is stigmatized, that is, genocide is stigmatized and criminalized as the crime of crimes. It's definitely illegal, a criminal intention, while the latter, military targeting, is usually legal and quickly forgotten, even if it results in tens or hundreds of thousands of casualties. And that's why advocates for Ukraine and Palestine fixate on genocide. As a scholar, I'm less interested in adjudicating whether genocide is taking place. After all, it admits of only a yes or no answer. It's like a light bulb. It's either on or it's off. It's like being pregnant. It can't be a little bit pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. But scholars are interested in complexity, not simplicity. But this absoluteness I talked about requires you to take a stand. Right? Now, that's the mode of being an activist, which I understand and respect. But that's not what academics do when they're in the university, at least for me. Okay. Now, why, though, is my question, is genocide considered the crime of crimes? Why are war crimes and crimes against humanity, which featured in the Nuremberg trials after World War II, rather than genocide, seen as lesser charges? Why this hierarchy in perceptions of international criminal law and in our imagination of evil? For reasons we can discuss, genocide has become a synonym for absolute evil, entailing utterly evil perpetrators and utterly innocent victims. I believe this is ultimately a theological template which draws on archetypes buried deep in our imaginations that are recruited when trying to explain immense suffering and its causes. Genocide also addresses collective identity, as I mentioned before, in invoking large group emotions. It's an attack on collective identity, not just on civilian population, which is covered by crimes against humanity. So crimes against humanity covers or defends people, a civilian population. You can't kill masses of people in a systematic or widespread manner. That's crimes against humanity. Genocide defends the idea of a people, a specific particularity. Even if the same numbers of civilians are killed then, genocide carries a stigmatic aura with biblical connotations, a people disappearing from history. If you read the Old Testament, you'll see people come and go from the sacred history of humanity all the time. But once you leave, you can't come back, right? And that's the feeling of disappearing from history does possess members of small nations. In all the legal talk about the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, we don't much talk about these subterranean biblical imaginaries of evil, although I think we should. International affairs may be influenced by these imageries, but it does not reflect on them in the way I'm trying to now. Instead, it engages in what I see as a basic distinction. It draws a basic distinction between armed conflict and genocide, the former motivated by the legal and legitimate imperative to defeat an enemy when the killing is supposed to stop after victory. Then you have a peace treaty. or, your land is given to a neighbouring state. I understand that's happened in this part of the world over the centuries. Whereas in genocide, the intention is not to defeat, but to destroy. And that is always a criminal intention and never legitimate. Okay? You can't destroy a people as an end in itself. That's an illegitimate and a criminal intention. And that's, of course, why Serbia and the Republika Srpska in Bosnia reject the notion that Srebrenica was a genocide, because they say you stigmatize us as a genocidal nation, that our campaign for liberation in the 1990s was a criminal campaign. It was driven by the intent to destroy Bosnians. That's not how we feel, they say. We were trying to be free from rule by others, not to be a minority in our own country. That's the kind of reasoning you see in response. And so they say we were engaged in an armed conflict, and yes, there were some regrettable aspects to it. But an armed conflict, self-defense, is not illegal. It's carried out as a just war. They will remind us that self-preservation has been a basic prerogative of states since time immemorial. In the past, few limitations applied to state conduct when it felt its existence was imperiled. Now international laws insist that just wars are fought justly, meaning that the principles of distinction, precaution and proportionality are reserved. That's the language from the Geneva Conventions. If civilians are killed disproportionately in military targeting, war crimes may be committed. If attacks on a civilian population are widespread or systematic, we are talking about crimes against humanity, but not genocide. That is reserved for the intention to destroy an ethnic, racial or religious group in whole or in part as such. It's a very distinct intention. I think this distinction, which was crystallized after the Second World War, is deeply problematic. I don't accept this, although this is what we have in our moral and in our legal toolkit. And as historians, or as any kind of scholar, we can ask, why do we have this toolkit? Is it fit for purpose? Should we rethink these categories? After all, new categories can be invented. There's moves afoot right now to have a convention on the crimes against humanity, for example. But the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, passed by the UN General Assembly in late 1948, I argue, did not mark some momentous humanitarian step forward in outlawing wars of annihilation as commonly supposed. Because the states that thrashed out the convention designed it so that their state sovereignty would not be compromised in pursuing their security interests. In other words, so they could continue wars of annihilation if they felt they needed to. How? The answer is that the convention criminalized, as I've said, only a very narrow and virtually impossible to prove modality of mass violence, and elevated it to the crime of crimes, meaning that other modes of state violence were not too bad, or at least less shocking. These states, and I'm talking about the victors in World War II, did not regard warfare as illegitimate. They had just defeated the Axis powers, destroyed their cities with fire and atomic bombs, and countenanced the forced expulsion of 12 million ethnic Germans from East Central Europe. The Cold War was beginning, and independence movements confronted the Western colonial empires, which were reasserting control in Asia and North Africa. For the war's victors, the sovereign right of states to engage in international and non-international armed conflict required the rescue of military necessity from its discrediting by the Nazi mode of exterminatory warfare and occupation. Everyone at the time understood that armed conflict impacted civilians dramatically. The official committee of experts' commentary on the draft Genocide Convention, written in part by Lemkin, who, as I said, coined the term in World War II, acknowledged that civilian populations were affected by modern warfare in, quote, more or less severe losses, unquote. So the committee distinguished between armed conflict and genocide by arguing, quote, that in genocide, quote, one of the belligerents aims at exterminating the population of enemy territory and systematically destroys what are not genuine military targets, unquote. Military objectives, by contrast, aimed at imposing a victor's will on the loser, whose existence was not imperiled, according to this reasoning. Killing masses of civilians was acceptable, if regrettable. Tragic is the word that slips out from Netanyahu's mouth whenever he feels cornered. Be quickly moving on to the need to expel Palestinians. This is all acceptable if motivated by military goals, victory, not destruction. That was the argument of the US chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Robert Jackson, when he wrote an article for the New York Times magazine to explain the impending proceedings in Nuremberg to the US public. In an article called The Worst Crime of All, he justified why aggressive wars were Nuremberg Charter's supreme crime. That was the crime of crimes then. It was aggressive warfare. Because the other crimes, crimes against humanity and war crimes, which were listed in the Nuremberg Charter, derived from the German invasion. Without the German war of aggression, these other crimes wouldn't have occurred. So that was the crime of crimes at Nuremberg. Appearing a month after the US dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japanese cities, the article drew a further, I think, terrible conclusion. These are the key quotes. If there are to be future wars, we have got to win them, he declared, by being better killers, by killing more and killing more quickly than the enemy, by killing with less risk to ourselves. So this is the hero of Nuremberg. This article has been totally forgotten. I kind of stumbled across it in writing this book. In elaborating this argument, Jackson advocated violating the legally established principle of distinction between combatants and non-combatants by casting warfare as a conflict between peoples rather than military forces. For the fact is obvious that modern warfare has become more and more a struggle between whole populations, not between armies alone. The issue is which shall be subjugated and which will survive, unquote. Consequently, he continued, it was necessary in future wars to kill and maim the enemy and to destroy all that shelters him and all that he lives by, not only in the field but at home. So he's thinking of the bombing of cities in particular. Killing the enemy's civilians until they surrendered was the strategy, as the unmentioned cases of Hiroshima and Nagasaki indicated, of course. The Nazis, by contrast, had murdered civilians, he said, for no military purpose when he was before the Nuremberg tribunal. Now, this, of course, is the reasoning of Chuck Schumer and Ehud Olmert we saw a few minutes ago. Hamas killed for no military reason, solely because of anti-Semitic hatred, whereas Israel is operating with a military logic of defeat and is thereby legitimate. The fact that Israel kills over 60 times more Palestinians than Hamas killed Israelis and others on the 7th of October, quite apart from the laying waste of Gaza, is irrelevant to this kind of argument. What matters is not the result, but the quality of the intention, okay, in this mode of reasoning. Strange as this may seem to you, this is the law. And that is why, in my view, the legal approach to genocide falls behind the reality we can see unfolding before our eyes in many armed conflicts around the world. Okay? How did the UN Convention affect this distinction? First, it states that genocide means the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, as you can see at the top, by various means. Now, as such requires that the victims are targeted solely on the grounds of their identity, for symbolic rather than material reasons like, say, warfare. The states negotiating the convention's definition deliberately modelled it on the Holocaust, understood as history's largest hate crime, to distinguish it from warfare and even population expulsions like ethnic cleansing, which they themselves had engaged in just a year before in East Central Europe with the expulsion of the Germans. And of course, India and Pakistan weren't going to sign up for this either, because their states, which had just been created in partition, 1947, were predicated on population exchanges and all the violence that went with it. And of course, what else happened in 1948? So while the negotiations for the Genocide Convention are underway, you have the attempted partition of Palestine and the Nakba and the expulsion of the Palestinians. It's no accident that ethnic cleansing, population transfer, expulsion. These words do not appear in the Genocide Convention. And if you look at the drafting history, the states are quite open about why that's the case. Syria and Yugoslavia tried to get it in and were defeated at the committee level. Repressing political opposition and destroying entire peoples in warfare was now all the easier because the genocide threshold increasingly functioned to screen out military necessity and most permanent security practices. As a consequence, the wars waged ever since, in which many millions of civilians have died, cannot legally be categorized as genocide, or very hard to, or even rhetorically. We'll get to the case of Vietnam later. As a consequence, we think more about the victims of genocide during World War II than the overall civilian casualties, which are a staggering 30 million. Okay. What I want to show in this lecture is how this distinction was affected in the course of conflict since the 1960s, and I'm going to focus just on one at the end, on Vietnam. Now, in the book that I published 4 years ago, The Problems of Genocide, I argue that this distinction has two consequences. First, those who seek to have their case recognized as genocide need to cast it in Holocaustal terms, namely as a drama of politically passive, innocent civilians murdered solely on the grounds of their identity, for being who they are, not for anything they've done. Okay. And we observe how in mobilizing or refuting genocide accusations, both as a rhetorical and legal claim, actors routinely invoke Holocaust analogies. Some are successfully made, like in the Rwanda case, but most are not, because the armed conflict in which civilians are destroyed don't resemble the Holocaust for most observers. That was the case in Vietnam and also in the Biafra-Nigeria civil war in the late 60s. Some of you here may remember it, okay? Insisting on genocide, this is the second point, as the crime of crimes blinds us, as I've said, to much violence against civilians, which is effectively excused as collateral or incidental, attendant to the operations of military necessity, the unintended consequence of attacking of what are claimed to be military targets. Now, note the cover on the book. They are, the victims in that picture, a Yemeni family who died in a Saudi airstrike in 2005. They are not victims of genocide, and so they are forgotten. I put them on the cover, an image drawn by the Yemeni artist Murad Subeh, to signal that they should not be forgotten, and that the problem of genocide is that we forget civilian victims who can't claim the lofty status of being victims of genocide. Of course, this family could easily be a Palestinian family in Gaza. One reason I chose the Yemen civil war is, A, I found this terrific picture drawn by Murad Subeh, and he drew it in the building itself. It's not in an art gallery. He's a street artist in the Banksy tradition, though I think much more profound, and the book takes a close-up of that. But he drew it in the room in which they were killed by a Saudi missile in 2015. He adds the raven to signal what happened. They were killed, and then the picture is slightly a kilter. As you can see, it's to the side to show the impact of the blast. And the picture is called Family Portrait. Of course, if I'd put a Palestinian family from Gaza on the book, you can imagine the outcry and the reception of the book. And I decided we'll let the arguments do the talking. And this was all planned in 2020, not today. But I think the image resonates to today. So we need to ask, why do victims feel the need to claim genocide? Why there is this hierarchy? Now, this distinction between genocide and general civilian destruction was not initially implicit in the thought of Raphael Lemkin, who coined the concept in his book, Axis, Rule in Occupied Europe. He began his justification, okay, it's a little out of order now, okay. He began his justification when he declared that the distinction between civilians and combatants was elemental to the crime of genocide. He said genocide was the antithesis of what he called the Rousseau Brutalis doctrine. You don't need to know that. But he said maybe implicit in the Hague regulations, he's referring to the Hague regulations of 1899-1907, so it's an international treaty. This doctrine holds that war is directed against sovereigns and armies, not against subjects and civilians. So no wars of annihilation, right? You keep it as a transaction between militaries without the population. He continued, in its modern application in civilized society, the doctrine means that war is conducted against states and armed forces, not against populations. Okay, so that's his premise in this book. Here, Lemkin promisingly declared that criminality was defined as warfare waged against populations rather than armies. Today, customary international law refers to the principle of distinction, which I mentioned before. Indeed, Westerners long regarded their mode of warfare as civilized and humanitarian even because of this distinction, whereas they said, like Treitschke, the German historian, gave an infamous speech about this, I think in the 1870s, where he said, the savages don't make this distinction, like they butcher each other's women and children, and that's savage warfare. And the whole tribe goes to war, as he put it. But we don't do that. We distinguish in this way, and that's what makes us civilized and Christian. Now, Lemkin wasn't the only émigré scholar who was observing the mode of the Nazi regime and its occupation and trying to figure out what is this war of annihilation really all about. One of them was the Austrian Jewish jurist and political scientist Ernst Fried, who migrated to the US in 1938 and worked as a research assistant in the Institute for Social Research in New York. His book here from 1942, called The Guilt of the German Army, discerned what he called a qualitatively new phase of German militarism and its style of warfare. He called it a concentration camp warfare and extermination militarism. Now, those of you who know German, you could easily imagine someone in a German mind thinking, ein Konzentrationslager, Kriegsart und Vernichtungsmilitarismus. It'd be one long word, right? It's what Germans like. I don't know if Danish does the same. So it's not really it's very accurate, but it's not really like a handy slogan, right? Then there was, and this is just a sample, Frank Munk, on the top left, a Czechoslovak political economist who worked at various US universities and at UNRWA. In his book from 1943, The Legacy of Nazism, the economic and social consequences of totalitarianism, he discerned what he called a German space politics, Raumpolitik, an expansionism that manifested itself in multifaceted attacks on what he called persecuted minority groups, indeed in the wholesale destruction of racial or national groups. So, that's what Lemkin is saying, wholesale destruction of racial and national groups. Then there was, if you look on the bottom right, Simon Siegel, like Lemkin, a Polish-born Jew, born in 1900, exactly like Lemkin, who worked for the American Jewish Committee after migrating to the US in 1935. His book, The New Order in Poland, from 1942, which Lemkin read, depicted in great detail the various dimensions of the Nazi restructuring and plundering of his native land. Also a player was the Institute for Jewish Affairs, a research unit in New York City, founded by the World Jewish Congress in 1941. Its purpose was post-war planning, but the disastrous news from Europe required drastic revision about the assumption about the size of the Jewish population available for migration to Palestine, or requiring minority protection after Germany's defeat. The Institute's focus consequently moved to establishing wartime facts about the treatment of Jews in the lands between the Baltic states and Greece, in other words, which were occupied by the Germans or allies of the Germans, like Croatia, in particular regarding individual and minority rights and modern economic nationalism, anti-Semitism, and refugees. And it produced books like this, listing the various means of destruction, like planned starvation, forced labor, deportation, pogroms, and methodical murder in the German-run extermination centers of Europe. And that's a quote. The one on right, as you can see, centers on starvation. All these publications, and there are many more, highlighted the multidimensional nature of access rule, The Germans took over the economy, banned local languages, engaged in deportations, transferred to German families children considered racially valuable, arrested and murdered cultural elites, plundered forests, and so forth. Their nations were being destroyed in a variety of ways, and massacres was only one element of this ordeal, and the extermination camp system established by the Nazis was only really vaguely understood very late in 1942. Most of these publications are from just before that. This was also the analytical approach of the Polish and Czechoslovak governments in exile, who produced books like this that also highlighted the multidimensional mode of the Nazi conquest, occupation and destruction. That's the New Order in Poland, produced by the Polish government. Here's the one produced by the Czechoslovak government. I don't know if you can read that, but you can see how they divide up the multidimensional nature of occupation and destruction. You have invasion, political persecution, destruction of Czechoslovak autonomous life, atrocities, then Germanization, persecution of Christian churches, persecution of Jews, economic enslavement. 7 is destruction of Czech schools, the persecution of Czechoslovak cultural life, etc. Okay, and if you go back to the Polish one, you'll see the third section is the struggle against the Polish spirit, etc. Okay, so this is a common mode of analysis. Now, Lemkin copied that in this book with what he called his 6 or 7 techniques of genocide. And he read these books and was in constant touch with these governments in exile. So, this produced his very broad definition of genocide here. Oh, that was that quote from before. But his very broad definition of genocide includes the cultural dimension, political dimension, economic, and even a moral dimension at the very bottom. Now, although the UN delegates did not use the term Holocaust when they were turning this into codifiable international law, they were acutely conscious of the Nazis' extermination policies against Jews and defined genocide to capture their extremity, above all, the racial focus and ideological motivation. Leaders of small nations like Czechoslovakia, which were subject to Nazi occupation, also regarded German policies as an attack on their nationality. And Lemkin courted their leaders, like Masaryk after the war, to win their support for a genocide convention. So instead of following his assumption in this quote I mentioned before on the Rousseau-Portalis doctrine, in which civilian immunity in general was the principle, he now fixated on ethnic and national groups as victims of massive hate crimes because he regarded them as the building blocks of humanity. So in the end, he doesn't develop a general framework that includes the targeting of entire peoples as military objectives in armed conflict. And this is where I think it all goes wrong. Lemkin's imaginary of humanity as an ensemble of peoples with unique national spirits was a product of his own nationalism, itself a version of small nations consciousness, and its intense attachment to vulnerable cultural identity, which was hegemonic in the first half of the 20th century in East Central Europe and parts of Western Europe. Now, we've adopted this ethnic national human ontology and made it a barely acknowledged basis of the hierarchy of criminality. Killing a people is genocide, but killing people in general, and even if the numbers are much greater, as we're seeing in Gaza, is not genocide for many people, and thus it's less grave. You saw the reasoning from Chuck Schumer, okay? In fact, if you disagree with him, you're an anti-Semite. You're harboring genocidal intentions against him. And this has real consequences in America now, you know, if you're a student on a foreign visa, right? Now, as a consequence of genocide's depoliticization, that's what I call it, it's convenient for actors to demarcate genocide from civil war and insurgency, as well as from warfare proper. Fatally, then, Lemkin and the UN monumentalized only depoliticized racial destruction, thereby attenuating the principle of distinction that he himself invoked originally in his book. And the UN Convention then entrenched the virtually untrammeled sovereignty of states in their internal affairs and a relatively free hand in waging aerial warfare abroad. It was inconceivable for the community of nations to protect civilians in general. We're talking about the late 40s when the convention was formulated, when they met to implement the so-called human rights revolution, because that would entail proscribing their own conduct during World War II and tying their hands in defending their empires or in waging the coming war, which became the Cold War, but people didn't know it would be a Cold War, they thought it would be a hot war, with their ideological opponents. But why the stigma of genocide? During the UN debate about the Genocide Convention in 1947 and 48, state representatives stigmatized the crime because they were essentially codifying, as I've said, what the recently defeated Nazis had been doing to Jews and Slavs. The mass murder of enemy civilians targeted because of ethnic and racial sense of superiority. This represented barbarism, they said, while they incarnated civilization. And for this reason, Israel and Arab nations, India and Pakistan, here, these are from the New York Times from 1947 and 48, immediately invoked the term against each other in the partition violence of 1947 and 48. So it immediately becomes a buzzword, very much like today. At the same time, émigré Baltic leaders accused the Soviet Union of genocide for deporting and otherwise destroying their elites and national culture when the Soviets reoccupied the 3 Baltic states. From the outset, then, genocide was a powerful diplomatic trope to be hurled during the incipient Cold War. And genocide was so powerful, and this is the important point, because its archetype was the Holocaust of European Jewry, which many even then understood as representing the most significant extermination in history. And if you read the UN debates, that's very clear. The common denominator was a domestication of the genocide concept and then the Genocide Convention so that it would not threaten state sovereignty, as I said before, and its security and sovereignty, security, discretion, raison d'etat. Raison d'etat could not be constrained in a global order constituted by states, whether for empire states like the Netherlands, which was trying to get back the East Indies from the Japanese after the Second World War, or states like Nigeria and Pakistan in repressing separatist movements in the 60s and the 70s, and doing so in genocidal ways, and during which genocide was alleged. There were international debates about genocide in those cases in the same way we're having a debate about Gaza today. Well, how many of you know that? It's totally forgotten. Now, these distinctions were thrashed out at the UN in the 1940s. Now, what I want to show briefly is how genocide modelled on the Holocaust as a massive hate crime driven by purely ideological and irrational motives, killing people solely on the basis of who they are, not for anything they've done, how this was constructed in practice, and how a non-political understanding of genocide broke through and has become remarkably resilient and structures our debate about Gaza today. So we're going to talk now. How much time have I got left? A few minutes, because I just want to run through a few of these slides. 2 minutes. Okay, 20 minutes is what I saw. So the 20 minutes. So I'll be quick. So I'll just run through the slides rather than give the text. So the allegation that America was engaged in genocide began very quickly with US critics, liberal and left-wing critics within the US, including this sociologist. So he's a liberal, but the SDS, so the student left, started talking about genocide in Vietnam already in the late 60s. And so did people further to the left. This was a supplement from a communist newspaper calling it genocide in Vietnam. And then, of course, in Cuba, they were going to talk about the imperialist American genocide in their advocacy publication. It says Fidel Castro denouncing America for genocide at the time. But the most famous episode in this case about genocide in the US was, of course, at the Russell Tribunal somewhat later. Here they are, always cigarettes with Sartre. That's him on the top left. And Sartre wrote this famous book called On Genocide, making a case that genocide is taking place. Now, this became celebrated at a time, though how many of you know or have read this book, right? How was he defeated? In the end, Sartre lost the argument. He was defeated by these arguments. This is the philosopher Hugo Adam Bedau, who in a philosophy journal wrote a long argument. It's exactly the same as the Israeli case at the ICJ, and this is how he argues. Genocide, and this is a quote, genocide is not just another crime, not even another war crime or a crime against humanity. For many, it is the ultimate offence. Moreover, accusations of genocide in our time are coloured by the paradigm case, still very much within living memory, the treatment of the European Jews and other undesirables by the Nazi government. The very term genocide entered our language as a designation of that Holocaust. That's what I mean by genocide, as the archetype or model or ideal type, to use Max Weber's terms. Another critic was the German-born political scientist Günter Levy, as you can see, born in Breslau, or what is now known as Wrocław, right, in 1923. And he wrote this book, America and Vietnam, and then these other anti-communist tirades, frankly, where he argued that this is not genocide. And so did Norman Podhoretz, the neocon. And these are very briefly the arguments, and then I'll wrap up here. Okay. But it's important that you see what they say, because they are structuring our categories about the argument right now in regard to Gaza. The prototype of genocide, which inspired the convention, was, of course, Hitler's attempted extermination of the Jews of Europe. For all but the pacifists, the decision as to whether any particular military conflict is justified, therefore, has to be made not on the basis of whether innocent civilians are likely to be killed, but in terms of a country's national interest. Okay? The bombing was no worse than Korea, where it had levelled practically all major population centres. He's talking about the war in Korea in the early 50s, which killed 2 million people and levelled 80% of urban infrastructure. There was much in the American military effort in Vietnam that was legal, but should probably not have happened. Okay? This is what Edward Olmert is also saying, right? While the American way of war undoubtedly took the life of many non-combatants, these casualties were never inflicted as a matter of policy. That's the key line, okay? The shelling was lavish. Lavish. Do you know what that word means? Like a lavish feast, a lavish, right? Not Barbette's feast, right? That was lavish. But civilian casualties were what he calls an inevitable part of modern warfare and modern military technology. I'm hearing those exact phrases from military lawyers who work in the IHL tradition. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to have those slides on Gaza. Maybe we can talk about them. I'll finish with that. I wanted to give you a sense, and if I had more time, I could talk about the Biafra case, where the same kind of debates occurred, and in other cases as well. The key is that taking an historical perspective as well as an analytical one about the concept, we can see that genocide was distinguished from warfare, and that although warfare, as they admit, can have effectively genocidal outcomes, and that is how wars of annihilation were separated from genocide in theory and in law. I think this needs to be exposed, and I think this needs to be reformed. We don't need to accept this state of affairs. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dirk. I can hear myself, so I have sound. Thank you, Dirk, for explaining to us a rather complicated argument that you lay out in your book. I want to start out by reading some quotes for you. And these quotes are from a press briefing at the US State Department. So a journalist asks, can you comment on that, or a view as to whether or not what is happening could be genocide? And the response from the State Department spokesperson is, well, as I think you know, the use of the term genocide has a very precise legal meaning, although it is not strictly a legal determination. There are other factors in there as well, but and a little blah, blah, blah. Before we begin to use that term, we have to know as much as possible about the facts of the situation. Curiously, given that so many people say that there is genocide underway or something that strongly resembles it. And then moving on to an interview with the US Secretary of State, asking the Secretary to comment on the situation, whether it's genocide. Well, I think, as you know, this becomes a legal definitional thing. Unfortunately, in terms of as horrendous as all these things are, it becomes a definitional question. This is not a debate over Gaza. It's over Rwanda, 31 years ago. This last quote is from then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, 7 weeks into the genocide in Rwanda, explaining why they're not sending reinforcements to the UN troops in Rwanda. So I wanted to start out with that because I wanted to illustrate how these problems of genocide are not only theoretical problems that we can discuss as scholars and we can have academic debates about whether or not this definition really captures the realities of the world, but the problems of genocide that Dirk has talked about as conceptual and historical problems also actually have some very real political implications. The Genocide Convention states that it is a duty for all states to do two things: to prevent and to punish genocide. And although the Genocide Convention is still quite young in some ways in international law, the punishment field, the punishment part of it, is far more developed than the prevention part. For instance, as Kjersti will talk about in more detail, we've had international tribunals. We've had the establishment of the International Criminal Court, the Rwandan Yugoslavia tribunals, of course, and various cases in other courts and tribunals, including the ones against Myanmar and Israel at the International Court of Justice as we speak. And the practice of these tribunals and courts have confirmed the very narrow understanding of genocide and the very high threshold of the requirements of genocidal intent that was set out in the Genocide Convention. So a concept, as Dirk has explained, that was strategically crafted in such a way that it would leave almost all instances of mass destruction of civilian life outside of the concept of genocide, has been interpreted by courts in a way that makes it almost impossible for any ongoing situation of attacks on civilians to meet that threshold. And as Dirk has explained, this is particularly problematic because most of the cases of what we call genocide happen during armed conflict. It is challenging enough to establish that something has been genocide through a court case, despite having all the available evidence and years of processing that evidence. For the first duty of the Genocide Convention, the duty to prevent, this becomes particularly challenging. Because how can you prevent something that is so hard to prove? That when we all finally agree that it's genocide, it's almost by definition too late for prevention. This is why, as I have argued also in relation to Gaza, it is imperative to be able to discuss risk factors of genocide before there is broad agreement that genocide is actually taking place. Otherwise, we are simply not living up to the obligation in the Genocide Convention. Will such an approach solve the problem of preventing genocide? Well, of course not. Rather, we see state actors clinging to the letter of the law, rather than engaging in a discussion on what risk factors are present and how they can be mitigated. In 1994, when massacres against civilians were underway in Rwanda, key actors, including the US, did what they could to avoid the genocide term. And this is well documented, you can just Google this and you'll find it, in order to not to be obliged to send American troops or to expand the UN peacekeeping mission on the ground. It is quite heartbreaking, actually, to read the communication between the general in charge of the peacekeeping mission in Rwanda and the peacekeeping headquarters in New York, then led by Kofi Annan, rejecting his pleas for more troops and an expanded mandate. 10 years later, another catastrophe was unfolding in Africa that raised the alarms of genocide. The attacks on civilians in Darfur led to an intense civil society campaign directed at the US government. Eventually, State Secretary Colin Powell said that genocide was taking place, but then he hastily added, this did not lead to an obligation to interfere. So what does calling something a genocide really mean today? What are we left with in terms of prevention? What would be the political consequences of us having an easy yes or no answer, switching the light bulb on and off to that question? In Myanmar, the 2017 forced expulsion of Muslims and Rohingya led to a debate of a genocide. And finally, not so long ago, the US State Department actually declared this forced expulsion a genocide. But if you look at the situation on the ground in Myanmar today, the situation has not improved for the Rohingya, quite to the contrary. And the whole country is engulfed in a civil war. Law, as I think has been made clear by Dirk, is always an expression of power. And international law even more so, because international law is first and foremost created to protect state interests. And states are institutions of power. To a degree, this is also the case for the Genocide Convention. And only by recognizing this, one can see why it does not work for prevention. Because states themselves are often the perpetrators of mass violence against civilians. And why would they want a convention that scandalizes this kind of violence? To go back to where I started with these legal debates and sort of hair-splitting over whether the threshold of intent and to prove genocide has really been reached, I think it is pretty clear that the law, or the lawyers, doing hair-splitting over exactly when the threshold is met, is not going to help us preventing genocide. Because almost by definition, if we follow that logic, it will always be too late for prevention.
Thank you, Ellen. First of all, can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the Holocaust Center and the University of Oslo for inviting to this absolutely necessary public lecture, and not the least to you, Dirk Moses, for giving such a clear and honest and complete dismantling of how genocidal violence, like what is being live-streamed from Gaza at this very moment, is regulated, legitimized, and perpetuated, even by law and legal reasoning, framing and rendering some lives among us grievable and others not. Rather, you show how through the invocation of security logics such as self-defense, threats, emergencies, necessities, some lives among us are rendered ungrievable, to borrow a term from Judith Butler, and as mere collateral of a state power bent on destruction. As such, I see Dirk Moses' work in connection with other great thinkers on law, politics, and violence, such as Georgi Agamben, and how sovereign power, through the invocation of the state of exception, produces what Agamben calls bare life, a mere biological fact of life, yet lives of no political, symbolic, or legal value. Thus, they can be killed with impunity. What makes your analysis so powerful is how this genocidal violence has become intertwined with a system of state power and state violence that can still claim to apply the law. Now, I have been giving a few minutes to make a few remarks, and I'll try to focus on 2 points. First, that the concept of genocide and its symbolic value has perhaps shifted the past couple of decades from a narrative of humanity's progress to now, with maybe Gaza as a tipping point, a narrative of humanity's rupture. I'm speaking from and to a global North audience here, which is an important caveat. And second, I ask, where does this leave international criminal justice? Now, Moses is an expert on Raphael Lemkin, the man who coined genocide, and is viewed as the entrepreneur of the Genocide Convention signed in 1948. But I think we must remember that the Genocide Convention, it wasn't drafted in isolation, but that it was part of a patchwork of international lawmaking animated by the atrocities of World War II. The UN Charter, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Nuremberg and the Tokyo Tribunal set up to deal with war crimes, leaving aside for a moment the question of whose rights and whose sovereignty that were gaining protection at that moment. There was certainly at that moment in time an international reckoning of something such as universal rights, and that this delicate mosaic of humanity needed protection from itself, including protecting individuals and groups from states and sovereigns. Now then followed the Cold War, and it became difficult again to speak of global and universal rights, needs, values. But afterwards, when Soviet fell and the US became the clear hegemon of the unipolar world order, economically, culturally, politically, it became at once much easier again to speak of, to define, to legislate global universals again. This means that the 1990s was the golden age of international lawmaking, and when we also saw the growth of human rights lingo, policies such as the responsibility to protect, and the creation and the consolidation of a legal field of international criminal justice, first through the UN ad hoc tribunals, and then through the entry into force of the Global and Permanent International Criminal Court in 2002, with jurisdiction to prosecute individuals for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Now, from a Western global North perspective, this development is a narrative of progress, a big step forward in what Ruti Teitel once called humanity's law, an international law made to protect people rather than to protect states, and where no one, not even head of states, were above the rule of law. But for us that study international criminal justice, we know that this idea is filled with good intentions, but that it is incomplete, that it is flawed, that it is even sometimes destructive in practice. And I've spent years studying how international criminal justice comes short and is even shunned by survivors of conflict. At a time, I concluded that these institutions built up in the name of humanity might be more meaningful for the international lawyers and the human rights activists that staff them and support them, rather than for those victims in whose names they are made. I saw international criminal justice as reflecting a dominant, liberal, yes, Western-based global order, and the call to punish and to end impunity for international crimes, genocide even, in the name of humanity. as a way of sort of reinforcing a humanitarian imaginary of this global moral order. Today, I think this narrative of humanity's progress is buried alongside Palestinian bodies. Of course, it's not like there hasn't been double standards before. We've heard about that. The construction of hierarchies of lives deemed grievable or not, protected or not, that is a core critique of the liberal international order. Think of Iraq, think of the global war on terror, think of the CIA's global program of kidnapping and torture in secret prisons around the world, think of the war crimes of the West that we've just heard about. But still, the grand narrative of a global moral order built upon international law and the civilizing discourses of human rights and humanitarianism, they still functioned, discursively at least, as a normative benchmark from which to critique state violence. And today, I think that this narrative, this language, might be losing its foothold. With Gaza, it's difficult to imagine how the international society can redeem itself as a global moral order after this. Our inability, our unwillingness to intervene in the slaughtering of Palestinian civilians has caused a rupture, I think, in the fabric of humanity, of this Western imaginary of civilization's progress through international legal norms and institutions set up to ensure, well, never again. I have multiple students that come to my office to ask, how is this possible? What is the point with international law if this can still happen? So where does this leave international criminal justice today? Now, I think it's fair to say that the ICC, the International Criminal Court's existence, it hangs in the balance. We don't know if it will survive this, going after big power, going after state leaders, Western allies. The court certainly has its shortcomings, and I won't go into them here, but among its bigger problems are political interference with its judicial independence, that is sabotage, and political opposition. For example, last year, The Guardian revealed that the Israeli intelligence service Mossad had actively opposed the ICC's investigation for over 9 years by spying, surveilling, and threatening ICC staff. And then there is the US sanctions, visa bans, and freezing of assets of ICC staff, including those of Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, now on administrative leave. It's been reported that staff have downloaded data and evidence in case these sanctions would impact the court's digital infrastructure and they would not be able to access their Microsoft platforms. This week, a friend in The Hague told me that Microsoft has shut down the chief prosecutor's email accounts. The fight for justice is certainly an uphill battle. And what is more, the court is being politically undermined by states that are members of the court, including previously staunch European supporters or even architects of international criminal justice. The UK, France, Italy, Poland, Germany, Hungary, they have all contributed to undermine the court recently, which I must say is particularly damaging for the legitimacy and the viability of a system of international criminal justice. Basically, my point is that when the court is actually pursuing a more universal enforcement of international criminal justice by seeking accountability for crimes committed by some of the world's most powerful states and our allies, this is when the court is fighting for its survival. This is also, I think, when we must support the institution, though I think maybe more so for its symbolic value of pursuing some form of accountability for genocidal violence than for its concrete judicial outcomes, which will be a long time coming, if ever. Nonetheless, I think the critical question remains, does the court's survival matter to Palestinians? Does the court matter for victims of genocide and other international crimes? To whom are genocide prosecutions important? For survivors left to live without their people? For international lawyers? For us, the onlookers, who bear witness but no responsibility or guilt? I think these are critical and important questions to ask in these times, and I thank you again, Dirk Moses, for your exceptionally important contribution to open up this space for us to talk about genocide beyond its legal framing, and for making clear that we need a more careful vocabulary to separate the destruction of a people from its legal regulation, here as either genocide or not genocide. And in doing so, you've shown us how this very regulation of violence is part of violence itself. And I thank you for that.
Do you want to comment or just...
No, we'll go straight to thank you. Driving many, if not all, of the mass criminality against civilians. So when I argue that these atrocity crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing, which are bundled together under this notion of atrocity crimes by the United Nations, that this complex array of crimes which we inherited from the moment after the Second World War you discussed, could easily be replaced by a crime of permanent security. I mean, this is utopian, it'll never happen, of course, but states don't want to inhibit their sovereign right to engage in drastic conduct when they think that their existence is imperiled. Certainly the Israelis are running a security line, but when you read between the lines, and sometimes it's not even between the lines, it's quite open. They're saying we need to expel the population entirely and recolonize Gaza so that never again can there be a 7th of October. Okay, that was for us a primal trauma. Hamas has said it would repeat this if they had the chance, so they argue. So this is our only alternative. And we're seeing the results today. So my preference is that, you know, in addition to talking about genocide, because you can't pretend that the concept doesn't exist, right? It's out there, it's a law. There will be a debate about genocide. But in addition to that, we need to challenge the security logics, pretext, and excuses that all states make when they're engaged in massive human rights violations. They always say it's self-defense. They always say we had no choice. They always say our hands were tied, our national security was imperiled or is imperiled. And then they engage in these outlandish modes of conduct. And they can be challenged because you can say, well, you are entitled to protect your civilians, as Israel is, right? But why do you need to take these other measures? That's vastly in excess of confronting an immediate threat. You're trying to engage in permanent threat removal, as it were. And in doing so, you have to attack all these civilians, okay? Because it's from the civilians that the insurgents come. There is a terrible logic and rationality to it. But that's what is embedded in the nation-state system. And that's where we need to look, rather than only irrational discourses of racial hatred.
Yeah. Carl-Emil, do you already have some questions from the audience? Yeah, can you come up? Do you have a mic? Yep. And Carl-Emil will share some of your questions, and we will see whether we were able to address some of them.
Okay. The first question I received was, if we replace genocide with permanent security or other concepts, do we not run the risk of just transporting the problems of genocide instead of solving them?
Maybe
so we'll gather a few.
Gather two or three, I think.
Yeah.
The next one is directed at Moses. Do you argue for a revision of the convention or for a more empirically based concept to be used in the social sciences and history? There's one commenting on the 60-to-1 scale. That's horrible. But if a large proportion of the 60 are combatants, it says. And then again to Moses, why are you so hesitant on calling what is happening in Gaza a genocide, when most of your colleagues are doing that. For example, Amos Goldberg, Niamh Gordon, William Schabas, and many more.
Okay, I think.
Yeah.
So that was, I think the two first questions were kind of related.
Yeah.
It was about the concept and whether it can be replaced by other concepts. And I think after you commented on that, maybe also Kjersti would like to think about that as a criminologist, about these, what are the chances of really developing these legal concepts? So you can think a little bit about that, Kjersti, and then, but first, Moses.
Okay. I anticipated some of those questions in my last answer, but I'll go over that again. Empirically or realistically, strategically, it's impossible to do away with the genocide concept. Not only is it an international law, it's got its convention, it's now in the Rome Statute, and this isn't going to go away, although the Rome Statute is imperiled, we just heard, right? But it's also a key word in the way we understand evil, and I don't think it can be wished away. So what I've been arguing in view of those circumstances is that the genocide concept in law and in practice, so as we understand it as an empirical reality, and then the lawyers hopefully and the judges follow, is to repoliticize it. And by that I mean that the excuse of states when they engage in this mass violence against civilians, that they're engaged in a military campaign against insurgents in which they happen to kill, tens of thousands of civilians, that excuse is, or that loophole is closed. And that wars of extermination, wars of annihilation, as Olmert himself admitted about his own country, are captured by the Genocide Convention. And that can be done not by changing its wording, which will never happen, right? But the jurisprudence of the ICJ can change that by ruling in a particular way on the Myanmar case, because that's coming up first. And there it's about the threshold of what constitutes genocidal intention, right? And that will then have a spillover effect on the South Africa-Israel case. So all eyes are on the ICJ, because as you know, as lawyers, and we're in an old law school here, the text is one thing, and that's set in stone. Another thing is how it's interpreted. And law is creative and adaptable and responds to reality. Now, it can sometimes be behind, as what I'm arguing, and this is my answer to the last question. It's like, how could you not say this is genocide? Say, well, empirically, this looks like genocide to me, right? But the law has fallen behind public perceptions and public reactions and sensibilities. And I think that it needs to catch up. I think there's a consensus on the panel about that. Okay.
Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. Yes, thank you for those questions. And I think you're right, and I think there is a sort of consensus on the panel on that. I think going forward now, the future of international law is unclear a little bit. It's more up in the balance now than it was 10 years ago, which means that things will change, I think, in terms of, Ellen, you said earlier today that international law is, a crystallization of power in a way, and I think you're right. And as global power is shifting, I think we'll also see changes to international law. And I think there, people need to be upfront and say that if the concept of genocide or the legal regulation of genocide isn't working, then perhaps going back to see and for it to better fit the empirical reality of modern warfare is absolutely something that can be that perhaps should be done. I think it's faulty to not dare to take on these discussions. I just also wanted to say something about the permanent security concept, which I think is a brilliant concept that actually in a way captures the logic, like the logic of governance that permeates much more than genocide, I think. And that goes into just the connection between warfare and crime generally, and how it legitimizes repressive politics in the name of security.
And then there was this question about sort of the ratio, combatants, non-combatants in Gaza, how that affects your assessment, or whether this is an excessive permanent security operation?
Well, I haven't read the question in its entirety, and you've obviously translated it, so perhaps you can correct me if I misinterpret what the question is getting at. My sense is that the questioner is correctly pointing out that these statistics don't distinguish between combatants and civilians. The health authorities just talk about a total. That is true. Let's say 20,000 of them are, or 30,000, so half are Hamas targets and legitimate military targets. Well, that leaves 30,000 civilians, and given the population structure in Gaza, most of them will be women and children. Is the questioner asking that or suggesting this is acceptable? I mean, has anyone been following the news the last few weeks? 50 Palestinians are being killed a day, and we know from reports on the ground, because hospitals and schools in the main are being bombed, that about 75% of them are women and children. I don't think that's acceptable in the name of military targeting. It's a genocidal kind of outcome, in particularly the gendered and nature of this, because it affects the capacity of Palestinian society to reproduce itself. Okay. I wish, if questions were asked like that, that they would take that human element into account and not engage in sort of a callous statistical approach and say, well, you know, a high percentage of Hamas fighters and then that's okay. I mean, that is the logic that I was arguing against with those quotes from Olmert and Chuck Schumer earlier. Yeah. I don't wish to criticize, by the way, Schumer and Olmert. In their own way, they're extremely sincere. But they are captured by a conceptual apparatus which they grew up with, right? But, you know, many of us are somewhat younger, and, you know, we can rethink the post-war order and the way, and the legal apparatus and architecture which was established in the late 1940s. I think we are at a crisis moment, as you said. We don't know, you know, where it's going to land and how the chips are going to fall. But what we're observing, and this is very worrying, and both of you hinted at this, or in fact addressed it directly, is that when the international criminal justice system targets Western-oriented or related authorities, then Western states are willing to abandon a system that they themselves established. And that's deeply worrying. Yeah. And unfortunately, it confirms the suspicion of many Global South intellectuals that the whole apparatus was a Western double standards trick to begin with, which, you know, I resisted in many arguments, saying, well, there's potential here, and as soon as the potential is realized, then, you know, even German leaders say, well, we would never enforce the ICC warrant.
There is maybe 5 minutes left of this event, so is there one or two more questions from the audience, and then we can respond quickly to those and wrap up?
Yes, I have one question here for you. It seems that international law is futile. As said on stage, it's part of violence. What alternatives are there for preventing violence on civilians?
I mean, you two should answer.
Well, I'm in this strange position of both being a panelist and a chair, so I'll give myself the privilege of answering that first. Well, I don't think it has to be futile, but I think you need more than the law. You need a broad coalition of actors. You need civil society, you need politicians, you need the media, you need intellectuals, you need much more than the law. We cannot leave this to lawyers to fight against civilian violence. So that would be my very short answer. I think if law is only seen, and particularly international law, is seen completely without context and only as sort of and only looking at the letter of law, then very quickly it can become part of the problem. That would be my answer. Kjersti?
Yeah, I think Similarly, in a way, I think one must always be careful not to compare law with justice immediately. I think justice is a much broader concept than law. But let's not forget that law and human rights and international criminal law, genocide, they're extremely important words of recognition. These are extremely important words of recognition. And legal recognition is the form of recognition that is perhaps the most strongest that we have. So I think it isn't futile. I think it is based on an idea. The concept that no one is above the law, not even sovereign leaders, is a beautiful idea. And I think that sometimes we should just keep going back to the idea and then critique the implementation and fit that, or try to fit that to better, try to improve the system rather, and defend the institutions that are, rather than just be disappointed and vanish them, because the world will certainly not be a better place without international criminal law.
So Dirk, your book and your project can be read really as really a criticism of law in a way. But so how would you answer this question?
I agree with both of you, and I don't really have anything to add, actually. So maybe there's time for one more question. Yeah.
Did you answer, actually, if you argue for revision of the convention, or is your argument more for social sciences and history?
Well, look, there's no chance that the convention will be changed. As I said before, it's set in stone. What can change is the interpretation of it. So everyone is looking to the ICJ to develop the law, and let's hope that it more accords, if you like, with the social scientific understanding of genocide, which is more interested in the results, like what we see on the ground, and the victim's experience, than in the difficult to determine, often impossible to prove, genocidal intention of states. So that would be what I hope would be developing. When I'm asked these questions, I try to resist, Dirk hopes for this normative judgment. I'm not interested in normative claims. We would all like international law to work better. We would all prefer it if states respected it. But the fact is that they don't when it doesn't suit them. Why is that? Okay, and in the end, it's political pressure that makes change. So, for example, the Australian state has confronting what's happening and wrestling what's happening with what's happening in Gaza, in Palestine, in Israel, has decided, because it's not going to send in troops to protect Palestinians, right? That's not going to happen, okay? But they're going to now recognize the state of Palestine, as I think Norway did long ago, right? But, most Western states, especially like a state like Australia, which tends to follow the Americans in virtually everything, right, this is a diplomatic innovation. And that's about applying political pressure to get the Israelis to not ethnically cleanse Gaza, to let in humanitarian aid, right? And these are the bigger questions for the real human beings on the ground there. Let's make sure they don't starve.
Yeah.
Okay.
And with that, we need to end. And a big thank you to Dirk for coming all the way from the US to enlighten us today with your ideas, and to Kjersti for participating in this panel with your insights. So a big hand to both of you.
Thank you.